Grant's Horses by Stephen Blackburn. Chapter 1. Shirtless and barefoot, blithely unsuspecting of what was about to happen, I picked my way through the shallow salt water, gingerly over the jagged oyster shells, hunting for pearls close to shore. I was waiting near the modest little pier Mr. Riggs had built with the notion that it would encourage traders who had boats. You could easily see the oysters blanketing the sandy bottom, owing to it being an unusually still day, with but an occasional whisper of breeze rippling across the surface like the trace of darting ferries, and nary a breaker to churn the sand to disturb the lens-like clarity of the water in which I stood. Yet to gaze across the empty expanse of the bay in the tropical sun was to be blinded by an emerald sea gleaming like silvered glass. Now, mind you, I had never actually seen a pearl, but I knew pirates and sultans prized them, and I had just been reading that such a treasure came from oysters, of all things. Learning that, I felt sure I could become a boy millionaire with scant effort, since that shellfish grew by the 1,000 bushel amid the shallows of our bay. You could scoop out specimens as big as a man's hand. And so I was gathering up all the likely candidates and wedging them open with my barlow, eating the disappointments in the grass along the shelf of the shore. By and by, still pearlless but no longer hungry, starting to feel my sunburn, I traipsed back into the water, still convinced that any minute I would strike it rich. About that time I heard, off a ways, this confusion of yelling and shouts. At first I didn't pay it any mind, for when droves of wild ponies got herded to the high-fenced mesquite corrals, there was generally a good deal of whooping and hollering. So I kept right on, my eyes peeled for any mollusk that might bear pearls. There wasn't another soul around the pier. I had me another pretty fair load and was fixing to start shucking them when it dawned on me that now the shrill voices of women and girls were mixed up with those deeper voices of the men, and that all now bore the unmistakable tone of urgent warning. Indians, ford up! Still ankle-deep in the ocean, I watched what seemed to me like all creation running and riding pell-mell for Colonel Kinney's compound on the bluff. I dropped my oysters and pulled foot. "Wait for me," I hollered. Before I had covered much ground, I got a stitch in my side. In the distance, men were shouting orders to each other and bellowing at their wives. Mothers were screaming for their sons and daughters. The stabbing pain made me consider what an arrow was going to feel like. Dread filled me. I wasn't going to make it. I was going to get locked outside the gates. Now, the bluff below Kinney's Rancho trading post is not all that steep, but that day it seemed a sheer mountain. I started crying as I clambered, clawed, slipped and scrambled, and slipped again on the trail up. My mind refused to conceive of my impending fate. Other than that, the details would be gruesome, painful, and horrific. Somehow I managed at last to haul myself to the top of the bluff, out of breath, dirt packed under my fingernails so thoroughly that even in my alarm I fretted about Papa seeing them before I could wash up. The shellcrete wall of the compound still seemed half a league distant, though it couldn't have been more than 50 varas. I spied the men atop the walls hollering and beckoning me. I made for that sanctuary, stumbling, focused on the gates and the gates only, convinced that if I so much as glanced to one side or the other, I would be met by a fearsome, half-naked savage, or 10, swooping down to scalp me with a tomahawk. Next thing I knew, I was bounding along with the lopping strides of a giant, just as in a dream, fairly flying towards the compound. It was my older brother Chance. On his Mustang Comanche, he had galloped up behind and laid hold of my denim braces, hauling me along, No time for him to try to pull me up on the pony. Now suddenly I could hear the thunderous hooves and blood-curdling whoops right back of us. The men in the compound urged us on even as they put their shoulders to the big gates to close them. Chance got us inside the rampart just as the gates slammed shut and a heavy bar got hefted across, locking them. Arrows thudding into the wood outside as a rattle of musketry popped off sharply, followed by the boom of a cannon. I remember glimpsing Colonel Kinney up there above me, atop the rustic parapet, shoulder to shoulder with my friend Chucho's father, Señor Jose Diego Aguayo y Alvarez, both of them coolly taking aim and firing. Beside them, Captain Bell called out commands to the colonel's ranging company that lined along all four sides of the compound walls. One of the rangers, Chance's friend Mayberry Gray, lately celebrated in an outrageously concocted but popular fiction, was also up there, firing his smoking Pattersons down at the attackers, looking as pleased as a burgher at his own testimonial dinner. On the ground inside the compound walls, Papa and my other brothers were busily organizing scurrying settlers, both white and Mexican, along with the Negro slaves. You could hear clatter of hooves outside, the banshee war cries of the braves, another volley of our muskets, and then arrows and lances thudding deep into the timber of the gates. All of the aforementioned perceived in a blank just before Chance flung me into the safety of the trading post store, where someone slammed the door shut and barred that too. My mother screamed at me to get down. Muti didn't wait for me to obey, but snatched me by the scruff of my neck and stuffed me down beneath the counter with a huddle of all the town's youngsters, including Billy Cobb and the rest of the gang. I would rather have faced the Indians. Well, if it ain't Wee Willie Wienerman, Billy said. Little boy Musina, another smirked. Another Shylock in our midst. Did it hurt getting cut off? Asked Billy. De qui hablas? Whined runny-nosed Chucho. He was scrunched on one side of me and his big sister Angelica on my other. Chucho hadn't been there 3 days prior, when some of us local boys had gone swimming in the surf. I confess I myself had some time ago noted the discrepancy between myself and my father and my brothers, but only when the other fellows and I shucked our clothes did I notice my divergence from everyone else and felt somehow ashamed because of it. I had been avoiding them ever since. Chucho's real name was Jesus Maria Agoyo. His family pronounced his name Jesus in the Mexican fashion, but he generally got called Chucho. That got around the same problem my folks had with me, which was how not to make the Lord's name in vain just by talking to me, and especially when they were giving me the what for. Me, I got called JP, unless Moody was especially mad at me. Chucho and I were the same age, 11, though he was scrawnier than me, and I was the runt of the litter in my family. Angelica was the eldest of his two sisters. The other one, Jovina, was destined for a convent. Several other siblings had died. His mother and mine were on sociable terms, but Mr. Aguayo y Alvarez was forever pleased that I was his son Chucho's tocayo, a word that meant we had a bond because we shared the same name. Mr. Aguayo y Alvarez was the spokesman for the vaqueros and descended from a Basque family that had arrived with the conquistador Cortez. Mr. Aguayo y Alvarez wore a straw hat brimmed as broad as his shoulders, held on with a barbiqueo or stampede cord. Too poor for boots, Chucho's father and most of his companions wore huaraches, woven leather shoes, with iron spurs strapped on. Truth be told, I preferred the company of the father to that of the son or daughter, and Señora Aguayo was one of the best cooks on the Nueces Strip. Chucho was a decent sort, but he tended to whine, and his nose constantly dribbled like a worn-out barrel tap. For her part, Angelica rarely let her kid brother cross her path without loading him up with all manner of chores that I usually got roped into as well. If ever there was a deceptively named gal, it was Chucho's sister. At 15, Angelica was a comely enough lass, with long raven-colored tresses and obsidian eyes. But I didn't care to venture within arm's length of her because most every time I did, her ornery nature ended up spoiling the effect. That gal would as soon cuff and scold Chucho and me as look at us. She tirelessly faulted us for the least nitpicking thing and seemed to especially enjoy bossing us, piling us up with a never-ending roster of chores that made the labors of Hercules seem but a trifle.